sit, here, you want to take this chair? Pull it up next to Ronnie.
Have to be around smart people for this.
Well, your wife is a very smart person,
Thank you very
so
much.
Thank you.
you bet. That'll be 20.
I don't know what you base it on, but okay.
That'll be $20, please. Okay, so last time, I asked the question, I didn't know if anybody else had any thoughts about this. Is there someone in public life today who might be a prophet? You discuss that. Actually, we did.
Say all
We did.
the things, whether you're
I did again.
Yeah.
Anybody who said Joel Osteen, I'll slap him.
Oh, that
Let
was
me ask
funny.
you a question.
Well, no, he was
Talking
mentioning
about all the
mentioned his
possibilities.
And just, from what we've talked about of the nature of prophecy, is there anyone in public life today who you might possibly describe as a prophet?
Today, as in living today.
As in living today?
Living today.
Pretty hard to come up with somebody, isn't it? Yeah.
Daniel Horwitz.
No, that would not be correct. You are exactly right.
I
Yeah.
loved reading that article about you in the Jewish.
Oh,
Herald.
Well, that's my 15 minutes of fame there. Yeah.
Is Daniel here? Daniel, you did a good job. The article.
Daniel
Yeah.
wrote an article
The
about
article.
Oh,
did a
some
very
rabbi
good job.
who plays chess, and he was very competitive in web server chess. So, so he became famous for 15 years.
You got about 10, you got about a dozen chapter people challenging you already.
You can give lessons.
I checked my email this morning, Bob.
No.
Yeah, so apparently this phenomenon, however uncommon it was in the time of the Bible, is a pretty uncommon phenomenon today. Okay. Now, when Heschel did his study on the prophets, he was not interested in probing the prophet's subconscious, what motivated the prophet to be who he was, or what his conditioning was, or what he affirms about anything else. We talked a little bit last time, what would a prophet say about America today? Right? I can't tell you what a prophet would say about America today. I can tell you a little about what Heschel said about the America of the 1950s. And because this course is not only about the prophets, but about Heschel's book on the prophets, I think that it's worth taking a few minutes to talk about that. So, what did Heschel say about religion? He said religion had lost its force because it was insipid, right? And he said this specifically about synagogue life too, right? He certainly wanted people to be involved in religious life, but when he would speak to conservative rabbis, he would criticize the nature of conservative synagogues. That it was like, he said the modern temple has a severe cold, right? It was like, and I think sometimes he was talking like sanctuaries that were cathedral sanctuaries like the Barg, right? Where, people, God is up there and you are way down here, and there's a big distance. And so nobody ever really gets close to God, right? When it came to justice in America in the 1950s, ouch, right? And so Heschel became involved in the civil rights movement. He was very close with Dr. King, and he made an effort to be part of that in a whole lot of ways. And then there was the war in Vietnam. Ouch, right? And and Heschel spoke out against the war, enough to where LBJ threatened Jewish leaders and said that I'm going to take it out in Israel if you don't shut this guy Heschel up.
Oh,
Wow.
Yeah.
What a classic.
Well,
LBJ was really not that nice a person.
no, I would say that's correct. He got some very important things done, some of which were actually very good, made a big difference in this country.
He did not
But-
have Israel that much.
But not a real friendly person. In his way, in many areas, he was very pro-Jewish and very pro-Israel, but he had his limits. He didn't like to be criticized.
He
So
was pro-Israel and pro-Jewish for donations.
So Heschel's book on the prophets was originally his doctoral dissertation, written in German in 1936. Right? And then after much revision was published in English in 1962. If there is one key term that you want to know about Heschel's book, it is this word. Pathos.
yes, over and over and over.
Yes, you will see it all through the book. Now, what does it mean?
We looked it up.
Yes, and what did you find?
It had two definitions. One was pity and one was sadness.
Okay,
I
that's
wonder
not
if
exactly what Heschel means by it, but it includes those things. All right? Pathos for Heschel means God's concern or emotional reaction to what happens in the world. Right? Now, many of us were raised with an idea of God that's very abstract. God doesn't have feelings. That when the Bible says God is angry about something, that's, it's a human projection. Now, to some extent, I accept that, but Heschel does not accept it at all. Right? Heschel says God cares about what human beings do. God loves, God pities, God cares. And that is implicit in everything that he writes about the prophets. Now, Heschel's daughter, Susanna, who is a scholar in her own right, she teaches at Dartmouth, she suggests that this idea was derived from Hasidic thought. And it really comes out of an important Kabbalistic idea. And the name of that idea, I'm going to write it in English letters, even though it's Hebrew word. Soreh Gavoa. Soreh Gavoa means the divine need. Okay? Soreh Gavoa is the idea. If you try to erase it, use the eraser side. Again, many of us are taught an idea about God as being all powerful, about being, independent of anything physical. Right? In Kabbalah, the idea is God has certain needs. God didn't have to create human beings, but he had a need for certain things that only human beings can do. That's the Sorech Gavoa, the higher need. Right? And therefore, so if this affects every part of Jewish life, for instance, in the non-mystical view, why do we have prayer? It's not because prayer affects God, it's because prayer affects us. Prayer does certain things. Prayer moves us to do certain things. It's a sort of a naturalistic explanation of prayer. God isn't moved by our prayer. God in this very philosophical view, is the unmoved mover. Right? That's the philosophical term for it. But in Kabbalah, in Jewish mysticism, that's not the way it is. God cares, God has needs, and part of our job is to try to fulfill those needs. This is God's pathos, and this is why God creates or sends messages through prophets, because there are things that human beings need to do, and some societies need a prophet to remind them. And questions or comments up to here? Yeah, Daniel.
So what's the definition of sort, English?
Sorech comes from the word srich, which means to need. Sorech is the noun form. Gavoa means on high, right? The need on high. In other words, the divine need.
Need, okay, thank you.
Yeah. Yes, Lou.
Going back to Heschel's analysis of synagogues in the 1950s, question about that. So was that pretty much a post-World War II evaluation? Because there was a big change from before World War II to after World War II.
Well, yeah, it wasn't likely to be heard before World War II. And certainly not during the war, right? You got bigger things going on, right? So to criticize the churches and the synagogues during the Depression or during the war, when you're fighting to end the Nazis, right? And secondarily Japan, obviously there was huge resentment against Japan, and that's what got us into the war after Pearl Harbor. And so you didn't see this kind of criticism so much until after the war, when it could be heard more easily. It happened in the Christian world as well. Heschel was very muted when he would criticize other religions, but he was very friendly with a great Protestant theologian by the name of Reinhold Niebuhr. Anybody here heard of Niebuhr? Okay,
No.
big figure in the Protestant world, and many of the same concerns as Heschel, that religion was insipid, that it really wasn't substantial, that it wasn't offering direction for the problems of America, and specifically issues of racial justice, right? And so that was part of where Heschel's, right? And it was a divine need also to address those problems, because as the prophets all tell us, injustice is what makes God angry and sad and unable to help the rest of the world move forward.
American life in almost every way changed from before war to after war because the men who came back from fighting needed to get on with lives, and also there was so much of a major shift in so many areas, including religious
Boomers.
life.
And boomers like us, right? Yeah,
We're the result of all
yeah, yes, in more ways than one. Yeah. Other questions or comments? Yeah, Jerry.
But didn't they adjust the services to allow the people who had to work on Shabbos to come in the afternoon?
Oh,
Those kind of
we're not
things.
talking about
5 o'clock.
issues of Jewish observance,
Yeah,
okay? The problem was not whether Jews were being observant or not. The problem was, what was the synagogue conveying? What was it teaching? What was it telling us that we ought to be doing? Right?
Everybody.
And in terms of bigger issues than whether you were Shomer Shabbos.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, Dan.
There is a speech that Heschel gave, I believe, before the RA, and I think it was 48 or something like that. And it's real clear when you read that, he is trashing Kaplanite.
He's trashing what?
Kaplanite Judaism.
Kaplan-
Okay, so let me fill in the blanks here, because I understand what Daniel's talking about.
Mordecai Kaplan?
Yes. So in conservative Judaism, there was a wing that really came out of, people who were influenced by Mordecai Kaplan, who taught at the Jewish Theological Seminary, who taught in the rabbinical school, and who was, very much against the idea of a supernatural God. Right? And in his view, Judaism, the things that we refer to as the mitzvot, the commandments, are really not divine commandments or divine needs. They are folkways. They are Jewish folkways. And yeah, you should keep Jewish folkways because they're part of what helps preserve the Jewish people. And we all know, we want the Jewish people to survive. That doesn't necessarily provide, I think, a very compelling rationale for maintaining Judaism. But Kaplan was very influential with a great many conservative rabbis. Rabbi Malev, by the way, senior rabbi of this congregation for almost 30 years, was a very devout advocate of Reconstructionism. That was the kind of Judaism that he espoused. Yeah. Heschel came to the Jewish Theological Seminary in 1945 after 5 years at Hebrew Union College. He came to Hebrew Union College because they were the ones who got him out of Europe. Okay? He got from Poland to England like 2 weeks before the war, before the invasion of Poland. Yeah, and by the way, most of his family was killed. Right? He got to England, and it took 6 months to get him to America. It was a processing issue, visa and transportation and whatnot. And so he got to Cincinnati, really did not belong at Hebrew Union College in the Reform movement and their teachings, but he was always grateful to them. He never criticized Hebrew Union College because they were the ones who saved his life, basically. So he came to JTS in 1945. He and Dr. Kaplan were very cordial and had a very good working relationship in person, right? And they didn't debate each other except through their students. Someone would come to Heschel's class and say, Dr. Heschel, Dr. Kaplan suggested in his class A, B, and C. What do you think about that? And so Heschel would respond to that. And then it would go back to Kaplan's class. Yeah. And so, and so people came down in one camp or the other, or sometimes a little in between.
Hillel versus the Shamite.
I'm sorry.
Kind of like Hillel versus Shamite.
Well, yeah, although I think Hillel and Shammai had a lot more in common
Oh,
than
yeah.
Kaplan and Heschel.
Yeah.
They were both scholars. They respected each other's scholarship. They respected each other's principles. But Heschel was convinced that that kind of Judaism would not inspire generations to come to remain Jewish. That there had to be some focus on the Tzorech Gavoa, although he didn't put it that way in his works, right? A lot of his theological writing in books like God is Not Alone and God in Search of Man. That alone is an interesting phrase, right? God in Search of Man. So those are Heschel's philosophical works in which he tried to translate a lot of mystical vocabulary into things that people could understand in English. Yeah, Karen.
So did he disagree with Kaplan's assertion about supernatural God and?
Absolutely. And so a lot of his theological writing, in some ways, it is a response to Reconstructionism and a way to try to make a philosophically coherent argument for a traditional belief in God, as opposed to what Kaplan was
So
promoting.
he would say it was a supernatural being and that.
He didn't use that term, but yes. Yeah,
I want to say something about, a few minutes ago, you mentioned Rabbi Malef. Am I saying that right?
Rabbi Mailer.
Malef. I never met Rabbi Malef, but I can't imagine that. Okay, Mordecai Kaplan, the original Mordecai Kaplan, and Reconstructionism is not the same as Reconstructionism today, the post-Kaplan Reconstructionism. So I can't imagine that if Rabbi Malef had Reconstructionist tendencies, it would have been like today's Reconstructionism.
You
Where
have
they
to,
changed the whole, where they changed so
you
much.
have to understand that at that time, Reconstructionism existed as a wing within conservative Judaism.
Yes,
And that changed at a certain point, I think more in the 1960s, late 60s maybe. Many of the leadership of the Reconstructionist wing left the Rabbinical Assembly and they founded their own movement and developed their own rabbinical school, developed their own institutions.
that was not Kaplan.
Well, Kaplan, I think, retired about 65, but Kaplan was, he lived to 103.
Oh,
So, into the 80s. And I don't think he disagreed with people creating a whole movement. There was a time when he felt that the conservative movement was the right place to have that discussion and to make those changes. And then when the resistance got to be too much, he said, okay, go ahead and found another movement. But really it was his disciples, people like Ira Eisenstein, for instance, who created the institutions of a Reconstructionist movement independent of the conservative movement. Yeah, Karen.
I grew up here. I don't remember Rabbi Malef giving these radical sermons that would have seemed.
yeah, I don't either.
I don't either.
I don't think he pressed the point
Right.
too much. What I would say is that he agreed with these principles, and he believed that most people at Beth Yeshurun agreed with those principles. And therefore, he didn't need to drum them in from the pulpit. He said, well, this is what people are believing anyway, right? I did know that I made, right? Well enough to know that there were issues. You couldn't, by the time people began to, well, let's put it this way, by the time Heschel had more influence in the movement and in the community, you couldn't really challenge Malef's position. He was a very dynamic leader. He had a life contract at a certain point, or, the equivalent of, I don't know that they actually had contracts back then. Beth Yeshurun's kind of an outlier in that respect. Their history, they generally didn't have rabbinic contracts. But Malef's position was very powerful. He could get away with a lot, and did. So, I don't really have time for stories about that at this
Another
point.
day I'd like to
If you
do.
want to
That
talk
would
to
be
me
interesting.
privately about that,
Okay, could you give me a thumbnail of what his
be in on that.
influence left here? Is that the sure?
well, Okay, yeah, so
I'm curious.
I think,
I can't hear the question.
so the issue is what, what's his lasting legacy? Yes, at Beth Yeshurun. So I would say, fact is, the main sanctuary service is a very liberal conservative service, okay? The chapel was created when the congregational merger took place in the 40s, but it was really from the other congregation, the more traditional congregation. And so, the chapel was like, it was where you went to express traditional Judaism. If you really wanted to daven, that was one thing. If you wanted to hear Rabbi Malev preach, that was another. And those lines didn't cross very much. Okay? And so the service in the sanctuary was way more liberal, and I would say there are, influences of that today too. Just the very fact that we don't do the whole Alein in the sanctuary service. That was Malev's influence. I'm pretty confident about that.
I think opening the ark was Rabbi Siegel's.
Well, the structure of the Baruch sanctuary is an expression, it suggests a certain majesty, but from a distance. It doesn't suggest to people that you could have a close relationship with God, that you could have an intimate conversation with God. That is not what the Baruch sanctuary conveyed or conveys today. Now, the service has changed somewhat. Stylistically, it's still liberal conservative, I would say, but stylistically, there are a lot of things. I don't know if Malev were alive today, he might well agree with. But those are reflections of, a desire, I think, to, make the service more engaging. I think we still have problems with that. And that is why, the chapel, against all odds, continues to endure. That we had the Museum Minyan, which broke off from the chapel over the issue of egalitarianism. And that, both of those minyanim continue to, I would say, thrive. The chapel is the address for the daily minyan. And so daily prayer, really is, I don't want to say it's not neutralized. It's set in this corner. I would say that only in the last few years has the idea of the daily service become a higher priority for the congregation at large.
Really?
I would say that because, virtually every day of the week, except for Monday, which is the rabbi's day off, you have a rabbi who, or the cantor who comes to the daily service. There are exceptions, of course, but that, at least in theory, is what happens. You have Rabbi Strauss teaching a class at breakfast every Tuesday, right? So, that underscores the importance of the daily minyan. The daily minyan was never a priority for Rabbi Malev.
It seems so strange to me, because isn't it a standard part of Judaism? I mean, it just seems like, okay, you hear the 13 main principles, these are things we do, there's 3 prayers throughout the day. It just seems
Yes.
such like a basic element that
Yes.
blows me away.
So Nick, if you define the mitzvot as folkways, as Kaplan did,
Right.
and as his disciples did and do, then you're not going to feel the same way about daily
Right,
prayer.
you're right.
Yes, Ron.
So how did he feel about people that had yard sites? if there was no,
Well, he would say, well, that's a lovely folk way of the Jewish people. And yes, you should do that. And yes, it conveys, it enables you to feel a certain closeness with your departed loved one and to recall them in a healthy way and so on and so forth. I don't think he would have discouraged anyone from doing that. Absolutely not.
Seems like there's a lot of arrogance in that.
Well, maybe. Lou and then Daniel.
I don't know how close Rabbi Malek was to Mordecai Kaplan at JTS, but he was not a student of Heschel, because Heschel didn't come to JTS until Rabbi Malek was finishing his studies.
That's correct.
Great point.
Of course, there were other people who represented a traditional opinion. They just didn't express it in the eloquent way that Heschel did. Right? Heschel, and by the way, the other thing you have to know about Heschel's years at JTS, he was a terrible classroom teacher. When he lectured in the European manner, and American students did not like that. And did not respond very well to it. Where Heschel excelled was in relationships. And so he developed many disciples. In fact, there were people who left HUC to go study with Heschel at JTS. And some of them became extraordinary scholars. Some of them broke with him later on, but a notable example of that, for instance, was Richard Rubinstein, who had been at HUC. He's the one who became a noted theologian in the 1960s in similar way to the death of God movement in Christianity. And he wrote a book called After Auschwitz, in which he talks about how faith in God has to be different after Auschwitz. Okay? And so Rubinstein, even though he loved Heschel, he eventually broke with Heschel, but he shifted. Similarly, scholar by the name of Samuel Dresdner, person I'm very fascinated with, and when we had scholar in residence weekend a few years ago, where I was the scholar in residence, even though I'm in residence here all the time. I talked about the Kutzker Rebbe and Sam Dresdner. He was the conservative rabbi who was probably most like a Hasidic Rebbe, and specifically the Kutzker Rebbe. Dresdner was definitely a disciple of Heschel's and wrote a tremendous amount of Heschel. My own teacher, my own doctoral advisor, Byron Sherwin, late Dr. Sherwin of the Spertus Institute in Chicago, was a disciple of Heschel. One of his last disciples, because he got his degree from the seminary in 1970, and Heschel died in 72. Anyway, so I hope this frames a little bit some of what Heschel was saying, because much of what he's responding to is the Kaplanian view, which doesn't have a lot of room for prophecy, and it doesn't have a lot of room for a personal relationship with God. Right? Now, when Heschel writes about prayer, and by the way, you talked about that talk he gave at an RA convention, that is in Heschel's book on prayer called Man's Quest for God, which it was the first book by Heschel that I read. I was a high school senior, had a tremendous impression on me, and I'm not sure that I ever would have become a rabbi if it hadn't been for, having that book put in my hand and told, go read.
Well, my basic point is that earlier on, you talked about tolerable deviance. In the morning, you talked about that. And it's one thing to look at the difference between Heschel and Kaplan as a tolerable difference of opinion. But when you read that article, Heschel was basically saying Kaplan is not sustainable.
Correct.
But if you look at Reform Judaism and mainstream, a lot a lot of conservative Judaism, Kaplan won big time.
Well,
We
I would
raised
say,
Kaplan.
Kaplan still lived in the Jewish world. And a lot of our institutions and our community institutions function the way they do because Kaplan said they should.
Well, keep in mind that Heschel said that wasn't sustainable long term. And
Well,
I'm beginning to think that's true.
yeah, well, I agree with that. Okay,
And his
that's my opinion. Yeah, I definitely think Heschel was right.
his grandson is here. Not in this room, but he's here with you.
Right, it is the fact that Dr. Dan Musher is the grandson of Mordecai Kaplan.
Oh,
Right?
oh.
So, I am not sure that Dan would agree with everything that his grandfather taught. But it's very interesting that certainly for his branch of the family, Judaism has been sustained, but it's a more traditional practice of Judaism than a lot, when I'm speaking out of turn, okay, because I'm speaking for Dan, but I'm speaking on the basis of Dan's actions. When Dan came to Houston about 1972, he didn't go worship in the sanctuary, he worshiped in the chapel. Right?
It's not a matter of practice, though, Rabbi, it's a matter of why. And one would say because I'm communing with God, and the other one would say because my grandfather, my great-grandfather, and it's a tradition and it's a civilization, and that's my Jewish identity as a Jew, and it has really very little to do with worshiping God.
Maybe, but I'm not going to go further on that topic. When Heschel writes about prayer, God is the subject. Humanity is the object of God's attention. And he sees that, looking the opposite way, as man being the subject and God is the object, that's narcissistic. Okay? And this is why there's a lot of emphasis in Judaism on the idea of revelation, whether it's the revelation at Sinai or revelation from God to a prophet or to any individual in an intimate moment, right? One of Heschel's students wrote that, Heschel assumes that all human beings have at least once in their lives experienced the momentous reality of God, and most of them have forgotten. Okay? And I think there's a lot of truth in that. That many of us, when we were young, we had an experience of God's reality, but we tend to forget that experience. We think we've outgrown that notion, but maybe we should. Right? So his idea of pathos suggests that there is always a divine voice that is available to be heard, that there is a prophetic impulse present in every human being, which can be triggered and activated. And this explains partly why Heschel was so open to interreligious dialogue, which a lot of people in the Jewish world were not in favor of. It's like, their attitude was, you guys just leave us alone. You don't like us, and frankly, we don't like you that much anymore, so go away. And Heschel said, no, this is too important to not discuss. He was also very skeptical of the motivations and the legitimacy of someone who, on principle, says he doesn't believe in a traditional God. Now, I want to take a look at a very few pieces from Heschel's book about what he has to say about the nature of the prophet.
Let me ask you one question.
Yes, please.
Okay, if this God, what you just said, is there, and everything is folklore. So are they really not basing Judaism on the Torah? It's just like a side book kind of thing?
The
'Cause-
Torah is very important. The Torah is, conveys the values and a sense of the majesty of Jewish history.
But it's not the word of God, like.
But, well, not really. Not in the
Well, I
sense,
mean, if you're
not in the
Hasidic,
sense,
that's everything.
not, certainly not in the sense that I would believe. Okay, and by the way, I'm perfectly comfortable with the idea that there is human input into the Torah, right? That, God didn't necessarily dictate the Torah word for word to Moses. I'm past that, okay? But I do believe that people were inspired to create the Torah based on things that actually did happen and experiences with God that actually did happen. I'm not prepared to go the Kaplan road. Okay? And by the way, again, I think Daniel is right that that is not likely to be sustainable in the long run. Right? There are people who might argue this, and I have a friend in the community who's been part of the Reconstructionist community for a very long time, and there was for a long while a small Reconstructionist congregation in this community. I don't see that it is something that's likely to inspire another generation. Because if things are just folkways, well, folkways disappear by the third generation. You all know stories about things that were passed down in your family, things that you know about your grandparents, your great grandparents, or maybe from even before, right? You have stories like that. And those stories may be very powerful stories, but they don't necessarily motivate you to live your life differently in the 21st century. Because the world you live in is a very different world from that in which those folkways and those folk stories of your families grew up. Right? So that's, and when I read Man's Quest for God as a high school senior, I said, that's my Judaism. I knew about Reconstructionism. I went to Sunday school, so we talked about different versions of Judaism. But I really didn't have a clear opinion about it until I read that book. And I said, that's where I am. Gotta be. And it's not like I had, religious experiences that, I am in the presence of God and I'm overwhelmed. I'm like a prophet or whatever, right? I didn't have any of those kinds of experiences. But I said, yeah, somebody's got to have that. And I want a piece of it, which is how I later got interested in Jewish mysticism, which is also part of a long-term legacy from Heschel. So here, here's what Heschel says about the nature of the prophet. Right? And also a little bit about the nature of God. He says, to us, a single act of injustice, cheating in business, exploitation of the poor, is slight. To the prophets, a disaster. Right? Now, I think this is by and large true. Most of us look at the injustices of the world and we say, how sad, how terrible. But you know what? This is the way of the world. The prophet looks at it and says, this cannot go on. This is outrageous. This is totally wrong, and it must change. And in that way, says Heschel, this is, the prophet as an agent of God. Right? He says, it seems incongruous and absurd that because of some minor acts of injustice inflicted on the insignificant, powerless poor, the glorious city of Jerusalem should be destroyed and the whole nation go into exile. Did not the prophet magnify the guilt? These little things, the importance of such trivialities, what generally gets relegated to trivialities in our society. Yeah. Lou.
Is it so minor regarding this paragraph? Is it so minor if the injustice is so pervasive in society? Wouldn't it then be major?
Well, that's his point. Yeah.
In this book,
That
page
most-
5.
But most of us would, look at these things and say, that's the way of the world. There's always been injustice. We can't solve it all. The prophet says, God tells me you better solve it. Right? Yeah, Jerry.
Okay, so in the Orthodox tradition, you say there's no more prophecy. They stopped it, right?
Yeah, the general belief in the Orthodox world is that prophecy ceased sometime during the Second Temple period.
Right. Okay, so,
I've never heard a convincing argument exactly why that should be. That just because, the Bible was closed and, Haggai and Zechariah, were the last of the prophets, that should be the end of the phenomenon. In the Bible, it is, right?
okay, so the question is, you asked about who do you know in today's world you consider a prophet?
Mhm.
So how do you judge who's a prophet? Unless you use the Orthodox,
Well, so for the Orthodox, the prophets are the ones who are in Scripture,
right?
right? I'm not convinced of that. I think, there are from time to time in certain societies, people who are prophets of one kind or another. But hopefully that will be more clear as we go on. Yeah, right.
Okay, in reading through the book, the part that I read, the impression I got is, and it actually states it, that the prophets start with, they're very negative. This is what's gonna happen if you don't change your ways. This is what's gonna happen. And then they give a promise, but if you do change your ways,
Things will be better.
things will be better.
God will not destroy you.
But, right, but over the course of the time that the prophets spoke, God never, even though the people did not change, the prophecy never came to fruition. You understand what I'm
Oh,
saying?
no,
I mean, buildings. did not
Jeremiah
fall.
prophesies that Jerusalem will be destroyed and the people will go into exile. And guess what? It
That's
happened.
one out of many.
Well, a lot, we'll look at Amos in a little bit,
Yeah.
right? But we may not get to that today, but we will.
But,
And Amos says the northern kingdom is going to be destroyed. Right? Guess what happened?
but
Right?
even
Heard of the 10 lost tribes, right? Okay.
Hmm.
So, you can say that sometimes the prophets, things don't happen in exactly the way he says they will.
So why would you listen?
Well, because, the
Bad track
real
record.
problem is not that his prophecies don't come true. The problem is people don't want to change.
True.
And some of the changes you're talking about are really hard to accomplish. Right? Is there injustice in American society today?
Sure.
How do we fix that? Man, that is really hard. Yeah. And, for me to be,
Critical race.
to make a difference in that, I would have to just devote my entire life to it.
Sure you would, and even to one part of it. Like to a
Did-
facet of it.
Yeah, one little facet of it. It would take, someone devoting every waking hour.
Absolutely.
And you know what? I like to play chess sometimes. Huh?
You do have some people
I-
devoting every hour. to
I have a part-time job. Yes, it's part-time. I prepare classes and, reading Torah and so on and so forth. So I don't have every waking hour. But if you're a prophet, man, you're overwhelmed with that responsibility and you're gonna move on it. I don't think the problem is that their prophecies don't come true. If you want to define Dr. Martin Luther King as a modern prophet, I think you will find that a lot of what he said has come true, and a lot of it has yet to come true. Right? We talk about the arc of justice, been slow, but it moves. Right? So this is, one of the challenges of prophecy, that it's not about little things, that things that, we often pigeonhole as little things, but are truly big things. They are the things that God cares the most about. I want to say this gently. God does not care about whether I win or lose a chess game or a tournament. Right? Really, yeah. That's more for me. Okay? God does not care about that. God probably cares a lot more about what I do and say about a host of other things. So, yeah, we all want to have a life of our own. And, at bottom, I guess we're entitled to that. The prophet, unfortunately, is somebody who doesn't get that. He doesn't get to have a life of his own because it's all taken up with the divine challenge, which is really tough. Right? And Heschel says it here, this is page 5. The prophet is a man who feels fiercely. God has thrust a burden upon his soul, and he is bowed and stunned at man's fierce greed. Frightful is the agony of man. No human voice can convey its full terror. Prophecy is the voice that God has lent to the silent agony, a voice to the plundered poor, to the profaned riches of the world. It is a form of living, a crossing point of God and man. God is raging in the prophet's words.
This
I don't
definition
know if
almost
there's-
sounds like someone in a mental institution.
Well, people think that prophets are mental cases, and I'm sure there are people who thought that about Dr. King. Well, after prophets die, that's when they're recognized as prophets. So now, today, not everybody likes this, of course, because even today there's resistance to prophecy. So now we have a national holiday for Dr. King.
Nothing to do with prophecy.
Well, maybe it does. Maybe it has to do with the fact that people recognize that his message was ultimately God's message for America. Right? But you don't have to agree that King was a prophet in the way that we have the biblical prophets. Maybe a little different way. Right? And you can argue about that. That's fine. You can argue with Heschel's view of prophecy too. And you're entitled to, but only before 1201. Thank you all.
Thank you,
We'll carry on
Rabbi.
next week.
What was the name of that book?
You have to get rid of critical race
God's
theory.